Okay, everyone. We think we've got most of the people into the virtual room here now, so we'll make a start. My name is Siobhan Lavelle. I'm a member of the ASHA committee, and I'd like to welcome you to tonight's seminar, which is part of the ASHA series of online seminars that we run to raise awareness and knowledge about archaeological issues and projects. I'm speaking to you from the land of the Darug and Gundungurra people, and ASHA acknowledges the traditional owners of country and recognises their continuing connection to land, water, sea, sky and community. We pay our respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures, to other First Nations peoples on the lands on which we meet this evening, and to elders past and present. So tonight's seminar, which I'm hoping you all read about when you were doing your booking on the ASHA website, is on the Southern Cemeteries Archaeology Project. Peter Petchey and Hallie Buckley have been directing the project since 2016, and they have been studying a number of historic period cemeteries in Otago in New Zealand. It is a joint archaeological and bioarchaeological project studying the remains of early European and Chinese settlers, particularly in the Otago Goldfields, with a particular focus on the health, well-being and experiences of the individuals who lived and died. 4 cemeteries have been investigated, and hopefully we'll hear a lot more about those tonight. So Dr. Peter Petchey is an archaeological consultant based in Dunedin, who specialises in historic and archaeology and industrial archaeology. What we would like to do would be take the questions at the end, and once Peter has concluded his presentation, if you could pop your questions in the chat, and then we'll try and work through and nominate people to ask your questions so that Dr. Petchey has a chance to answer them. So I'll hand over to Peter now. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Siobhan. Can you hear me okay? Excellent. Yeah, so thank you for coming along virtually, everyone. Tonight, I'm going to talk about the project that Professor Hallie Buckley and I have been directing since 2016, looking at early European settler and goldfield cemeteries in southern New Zealand, in Otago. This is quite a big project. We've looked at 4 different cemeteries and a few burials from elsewhere. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of information we've generated, so I can only present a tiny bit of that tonight. So I'm really just going to be focusing more on some of the archaeological material. Hallie, her side of it has been the bioarchaeological material, more the human remains. She can talk hopefully later on some of that material. And again, I'm going to sort of jump about a bit and really talk about a few different things and a few different things we've looked at in this project, simply because there's so much I could go on for hours. So it's going to be a bit of an overview, sort of once over briefly over some of the aspects of these burials, these cemeteries and these landscapes that we've been studying. Now, if I can get that to work. There we are. Now, just a warning, this presentation does contain images of human remains. We've been excavating cemeteries, so you know, just be aware of that as we go through. Now, the map on the left there shows the main sites we've looked at, as you can see, very much in the south of New Zealand. The main excavation sites have been Drybread, Lawrence and Milton, and we've also looked at some individuals from Cromwell which have been excavated through due to other reasons, so have been disturbed accidentally and so on. There's a number of research questions we've been attempting to address. As I said before, it's an archaeology and bioarchaeology joint project. And our focus has been on unmarked and lost burials in these historic area cemeteries. So we haven't excavated any burials which are marked. So no, if there's a gravestone, we don't dig. So that aspect of funerary tradition, the headstones and the study of headstones, isn't something we've done at all, because we're not digging those graves. We're very much looking for the ones that have been lost, and particularly the ones that the cemeteries, the people who run the cemeteries, they've lost themselves. Their records don't cover some of these cemeteries, and there's some of these burials, and they want to know where they are. What we've been doing is we've investigated diet, health, disease of these individuals we've been excavating and investigating. And that's very much Hallie's part of it, looking at the human remains and the isotopic and trace elements analysis of the human remains and so on. We've also been investigating funerary traditions and the culture of the early settler miner communities, and that's more my part of the project. So it's, you know, the coffins, the coffin furniture, how they're buried, and so on. So I suppose the overarching question is, what was life like? What was the quality of life like for these colonial era, these 19th century immigrants? And looking for the worlds they lived in. Again, this is my part of the project, the archaeological landscape. So we've got the cemeteries, and a cemetery is only a part of an archaeological landscape. And those people, they inhabited that landscape. They worked, they lived, and they died in that landscape. So we're particularly trying to find out a bit more about these places, particularly Drybread, which I'll get to at the end, the last sort of aspect I'll talk about in this project, in this presentation. Probably the quickest history of Otago you will ever see, and I am concentrating just on the colonial period. Obviously, there's human history here going back, 800 years, but we're looking at these settler cemeteries. So the narrative sort of starts in the 1840s, particularly 1848, when the first settlers arrive on the John Wycliffe and the Philip Lang. To join the Otago settlement, which was a New Zealand land company and Free Church of Scotland joint venture. 1861, this was the first big gold rush in New Zealand. Not the first gold rush, but the first big gold rush to Gabriel's Gully. And this is the gold rush that began to bring people across the Tasman Sea from the Victorian goldfields in particular. So many of these first people to come here in 1861 to go mining had previously been in Victoria. 1862, the even bigger Dunstan rush, that's further inland in Cromwell, and that was when things really kicked off in a very big way. Two prospectors arrived back in Dunedin with 87 pounds weight of gold, which was, you can imagine carrying that, and that really sort of set the Otago rushes off in a big way. 1866, the Chinese miners arrive, and we're particularly looking at some of these Chinese where they're buried. The first Chinese to come here actually came from Victoria. They'd been in the Victorian goldfields, and they came across the Tasman, but later on, Chinese miners were coming directly from southern China, Guangdong province, mainly Cantonese speakers. But everyone coming, they're all pursuing the promise of a better life. For the first settlers in 1848, the land companies were promoting New Zealand and Otago as the colonial experience as a way of improving your lot in life. The cartoon at the top and left-hand corner is typical. At home you're destitute in the slums, abroad you're happy and healthy and well-fed. Well, that was the promise. And the goldfields, of course, it was a similar thing. It was a promise of rapid wealth, of becoming rich very quickly. So everyone was coming here for a better life. The question we've been trying to address is that what they got? Is that what they achieved? So the Tuapeka rush. This is a very famous photograph. You may have seen it. This is taken by William Melwish. He was a Dunedin-based photographer. This is Gabriel's Gully. This is where it all kicked off. And you can see all these little small individual workings all across the floor of the gully, and the tents all up the sides. So some of the people we've been looking at were here in this place, living in these conditions. And of course, when you get thousands of people rushing to a goldfield, sooner or later, and usually sooner, someone's going to die. And the first record we have, Gabriel's Gully, is 3rd of August 1861, when William Henry Dowbiggin died in his tent after a night on the Terps. The inquest verdict was he died by excessive drinking and exposure. He was found in the morning unresponsive. He wasn't actually buried at Tuapeka or at Lawrence. We know actually he was buried. His body was taken back to an established cemetery near the coast, and we know where he's buried. It is somewhere else. But the principle's the same. You actually need a cemetery somewhere nearby to start burying people. It's just pragmatic. But of course, you need to make sure that cemetery isn't somewhere where there's gold, because you're in a goldfield. So you look for somewhere that's just to one side. So Lawrence is a town which was surveyed in 1862 at the mouth of Gabriel's Gully. There are 2 cemeteries. There's on the left at the bottom is the Ardrossan Street Cemetery, which was this gold rush one. This is the one stuck on a hillside near the diggings, but not in the diggings, so there's no gold there. And it was used for a few years, from maybe 1861 to maybe 1864, 1865. And then nearby, there was a much bigger cemetery, which is still in use. This was on Gabriel Street. This 10-acre block was surveyed when the township was surveyed in 1862, probably started to be used in 1864, formally actually opened with rules and a committee to operate it in 1866. And 1866 is often the date you'll see people say it's opened, or it's actually in use before that. And here they are. This is Lawrence, the little township. Originally, it was called the Junction because it was at the junction of Gabriel's Gully and Tuapeka Creek. Gabriel's Gully, where the rush started, is right in the middle of the top of this view. You'll see that the road going up and the stream coming in. That's Gabriel's Gully. The old cemetery there, as you can see, fairly close to the mouth of the cemetery, mouth of the gully, but a bit too close to the town and also a bit small, within an acre. And then off to the left, the new cemetery surveyed in 1862, used from 64, 65, 66. So we were, our archaeological work was in the old cemetery and at the very, very southern end of the new cemetery. And that's the end where the Chinese burials are. That was set aside for Chinese burials. Typical of sort of 19th century surveyed cemeteries, the new cemetery, the Gabriel Street Cemetery, is partitioned off into sort of sections by denominations. You've got an Anglican section, a Presbyterian section, and a Catholic section, and a general section, and a Chinese section. Very typical for the period. So Ardrossan Street, this is now privately owned. It was sold off in the 1980s because everyone thought all the graves had been taken away. That was the local story, and that became the official story, that everyone had been taken away and reburied in the new cemetery when the old cemetery closed and the land became private. Well, when we excavated there in 2018 and 2019, we found 24 graves, and they were all inhabited. Like, no one had been exhumed previously. So that was just a local story. So yeah, we excavated 8 people in 2018 and 16 in 2019. We had to go back again because we weren't expecting so many graves, because they are all supposed to have been taken away. We were expecting a few left behind, not a whole lot. And you can see some of our excavation team there, and the big area opened up. These sorts of excavations are very messy because you've got a big area to clean the topsoil off to look for the grave cuts. We did employ remote sensing at our previous excavation, and in the soil conditions and for various reasons, it actually gave no useful results. So we've actually found the best way of operating is to use a very large digger and take the topsoil off and look for the grave cuts. And you've got a ground truth remote sensing. We just get the remote sensing straight to ground truthing, and it worked very well here. And this is the result. This is what we found. From the scatter of the graves you can see there, this is a frontier cemetery. This is a gold rush cemetery. This is not surveyed. These are, there's a sort, you can sort of see 3 different lines there going down the ridge. And it's the ridge line which is creating the sort of the linear distribution, not any attempt to make this a proper, laid out cemetery. It's a gold rush cemetery. People were being buried there quickly, and then everyone's going back to, doing what they normally do, in a frontier context. It's very loosely laid out, big wide spacings, very loose lines, sort of what you'd expect not for the time, because it's the 1860s, but certainly for the situation people are in. The human remains, unfortunately for Hallie, whose particular interest is osteology, the preservation of the human remains was very, very mixed. This is burial A8. This is an adult male, and this was the best preserved skeleton in the whole cemetery. And preservation went downhill very rapidly from here, which unfortunately did affect some of our analysis. We still, various other people on the project can still do a lot of work on isotope analysis, looking at LEH on teeth, and a lot of that detailed analysis has been done, has been published, and is still underway. You can see this gentleman here. You can see he's still wearing the remains of some sort of top garment over the chest. And I'm going to talk about the clothing quite a bit actually in this talk in a moment. You can't really see it very well here. He's also wearing a pair of very well preserved socks. No boots. In this situation, boots were probably too valuable a commodity to bury. So probably someone else would have used them. But he's wearing socks. His trousers are gone. And we think that's probably because of the differential preservation between cotton and wool. Wool is a protein fiber, and it tends to preserve better in the conditions we've been finding. Cotton and linen are cellulose fibers, and not here and also many other sites around the world, it's found that cotton does not preserve well in an archaeological context. Now, moleskin trousers, cotton moleskin trousers, are often talked about in the historical sources as being what everyone wore. And of course, we haven't found any of them because none would have survived. We have found woolen trousers. So it's one of those situations where the sort of absence of evidence has to be taken as some sort of evidence. It's a problem, but not an insurmountable one. We certainly have got good evidence of the woolen clothing these people have been wearing. Other artifacts in some of these burials at Ardrossan Street, again, these are Christian burials, so you don't tend to get grave goods as such with Christian burials. But you do find, particularly in a frontier context where people are buried, in their everyday clothes, everyday items on their person. And here we've got a pipe. It was over the chest of this individual, so it was probably buried in his jacket or shirt pocket. This is A25. We didn't identify by name anyone in the cemetery, unfortunately, so he unfortunately has to remain as A25. And this pipe dates to sort of 1860 to 1870, so it's the right period. The one at the bottom is the same pipe cleaned up. You can see the maker's mark. He also had a belt on, well, a belt buckle, and this is one of these classic brass snake or or serpent or swan neck buckles, which are quite common in this period, and they were used often by the military. The British Army in India used them a lot, in Australia, and they continued in use right up into the First World War. You'll see photographs of First World War servicemen wearing them. So it is possible that this individual had actually served in the military, either in Australia or in British India, or in New Zealand. The buckle itself is quite well worn. You can see it's been bent out, and also the grooves worn in the snakehead. So, it's something he had had for quite some time. So there's little, snippets of tantalizing evidence about what this person's background may have been before he joined the gold rush. There we go. Now, I said I'd get back to the clothing. And I said woolen fibers survive much better. the preservation of even wool at Ardrossan Street was very variable. But this is the best preserved set of garments we have from that cemetery. This is burial A17, who was wearing not only a waistcoat, but a matching jacket as well. And these are actually the same cloth, the same fiber. So these two items go together. The trousers are gone. So either a thinner wool or, again, a moleskin trousers. So we've got direct evidence of what this gentleman was wearing on the gold rush, in the gold rush on the gold fields. And we can compare that to a number of the early photographs. 1861, 1862, photography was very much a thing by then, but to go into the field, it's still very cumbersome. So there are photographs of these very early gold rushes in New Zealand, but not a lot. It's nothing like the Klondike in, in Canada some years later, when there were some beautiful photographs where we are still in the infancy. But that's top right-hand one with the two gentlemen looking into a hole. This is actually an extreme blow up from a very, very good copy of that first photograph I showed you of Gabriel's Gully, taken in 1862. It's obviously taken on a full plate, glass negative, beautiful detail, and you can go in and actually see what people are wearing. And here you've got these two gentlemen. They've got the loose shirts, heavy trousers, boots, which matches many of the descriptions of what people were wearing in Goldfields. One of the things you have to remember about early photographs is the photographic technology at the time depended on good light. So all the photographs you tend to see in this period are on bright sunny days, and which means that these people are going to be out there in their shirt sleeves because it's sunny. They're not going to be out there in their jackets and waistcoats because it's cold. So you do get a slightly distorted view of what they were wearing if you just rely on the photographs sometimes. But the bottom left is a studio posed photograph, but the same period. This is 1860s, early 1860s. This is from the memoirs of handwritten memoirs of a chap called Houston. And these men were all diggers in Gabriel's Gully. They're identified, what their roles were and so on. And you can see, again, they've got the hats on, heavy trousers, boots, very loose shirts. And I'm going to talk about shirts in a moment again. And you may be able to see, certainly the chap on the right, you can actually see he's wearing his waistcoat, and you even see the watch chain there. So, waistcoats, watch chains, and so on were actually, everyday garments. So what these people have been buried in, these even waistcoats and so on, which today we would see as very formal, was their everyday wear. Just they were probably putting the best they had, but in a frontier situation, they wouldn't have had that much with them. So we're getting some really good sort of ideas and details about what they were wearing, the way they were dressed during the gold rush, and can compare that to some historical sources. Which takes me to the Chinese. The Chinese, as I said, came in 1866. The first few came in December 1865 to sort of check out the situation at the invitation of the Otago Provincial Council. They're actually invited to the Goldfields here because merchants and businessmen were concerned that the Otago Goldfields were in decline because the West Coast Goldfields had started up, and the West Coast rush had started in 1864. And so businessmen were seeing their business decline. They wanted new custom, and they asked the Chinese. So 1866, the Chinese started to come in numbers. And this is the Chinese section of the Gabriel Street Cemetery, where the Chinese died in the Goldfields were buried. And throughout the project, we were incredibly fortunate to have our Chinese collaborators, Les and Maisie Wong, working very closely with us. And they've supported the project and actually co-authors on some of our material. The research has been amazing. So they've been very supportive, and we couldn't have done it without them. And also they've performed all the appropriate ceremonies and openings and blessings and so on throughout. So at the Gabriel Street Cemetery, the Chinese section. Again, we went back a couple of times because we found more than, we didn't know what would be there, and we went back for another excavation. We found 24 grave cuts. We did run out of time, so we only investigated 18, but only 6 were occupied. 12 graves have been historically exhumed, and very, very thoroughly. We didn't even find a fingertip. They were very thoroughly exhumed. And the subject of the Chinese exhumations I'll get onto in a moment. I'm sure many of you will be aware. This is the site plan, and you can immediately see that this is a planned cemetery, very, very different to Ardrossan Street. The areas we excavated are outlined in the dotted lines, and you can see the graves are in neat rows, bang, 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 very, very tightly packed and very neatly laid out. This is a planned cemetery. This is, only a few years later, burial started here 64, 65, Chinese obviously after 66, because that's when they started to arrive. But immediately we're talking about a whole different ethos in terms of laying out the cemetery and planning and running the cemetery. This is a settlement cemetery. This is a cemetery of a planned, ordered town with a borough council and a cemetery committee. The frontier's passed by this time. The black shaded graves are the ones with people still there, and the grey ones are these empty ones, these exhumed ones I mentioned. Now, again, a very brief history of the Chinese exhumations. The Chinese who came to many of the actual overseas goldfields, it's not just the Otago, it's the overseas Chinese in general, many of them wished to be, if they died, to be repatriated back home for various cultural reasons, not least of which was just the desire to be buried in their with their ancestors, and where their families could continue to venerate them as ancestors. It's obviously a lot more complicated than that, but that's in a nutshell. The Zhongxing Tong was the society formed here in Otago to facilitate this repatriation, and basically you subscribed to it, and if you died in the goldfields you were buried for a period, and then there'd be periodic exhumation programs, and then those exhumed remains, which would usually be skeletonized but not always, would be put in new coffins and then repatriated. And in 1883, 230 people were repatriated in the SS Hoi Ho. But then in 1902, the infamous SS Ventnor left Wellington with 474 bodies on board, but off Taranaki it struck a rock, and then it actually sank off the Hokianga Harbour up north. And although, bar a handful of coffins that floated ashore, which were then buried in local cemeteries, almost all those 474 coffins remain in the wreck. The wreck has been found, and there's been a fair bit of debate about what to do about this. Many of these people actually never got home, which is obviously a major concern, certainly for the Chinese left in Otago at the time, but also for the Chinese community now. It's a major sort of cultural concern how the Ventnor is managed, and access to the wreck and so on. But that's why we found all those empty graves. Now, part of the process of repatriation was identification of the bodies. And what was done in some cases, both here and in Australia and in America, we're found in the archaeological literature sort of a lot of parallels, was these bricks were placed in some graves. And these are identification bricks inscribed with Chinese characters to identify the individual. So that the exhumation party could exhume the grave, and they weren't relying on people's memory or a gravestone which may have been wooden or may have decayed. They actually had these bricks in the burial in the coffin with the individual. We only found 2, so it's not in every grave by any means, and this is the same as has been found elsewhere, that they're sort of common, but not ubiquitous. Both of these bricks were individuals have been exhumed, and we've had them both translated. Les Wong carried it out. And this one here is one of the most comprehensive information. This is for a gentleman called Ardrossan, and we know he came from Stone Lake Village in Poo New County, so he's Cantonese. Unusually, this gives his Gregorian, his Western date of death, as well as his Chinese equivalent. So we know that he died on 5th December 1879. So he was probably repatriated on the Hoi Hao in 1883. So he would have made it back to China, and he wasn't on the Ventnor. Other aspects of Chinese material culture we found, particularly burial G7. This individual was there, and he was probably the most Chinese of all the burials in terms of the material culture found with him. He had this this wooden comb, which originally would have had, you know, very fine bamboo teeth over about his middle. It was lying on the body. There was also rice grains in the coffin. He had a coin placed on or over the head. The skull had sort of collapsed, so it was impossible to say where it had been buried. It was an English coin, but the tradition of having a coin in the grave is a widespread one, but it is Chinese as well. It's a threepenny bit, and it's 1887, so we know we know the date of his grave, which has helped sort of date the sequence of graves in the cemetery. But most notably, he was also wearing a Chinese style jacket. This was a Chinese style and cut with Chinese buttons, and I'll show you one in a moment. But it does appear it was made in a very fine wool. So it's possibly made in New Zealand, because wool's not a common fabric in China, but to a Chinese pattern or Chinese style. And there's his button on the right-hand side, one little brass ball button, very typically Chinese. And his hat on the bottom left there was over his head, a wool felt hat. And again, I was talking about looking at the photographs of the Gabriel's Gully miners. Well, here's a photograph of Chinese miners in the Otago Goldfields. This was taken by the Reverend Alexander Don, showing Chinese miners. And one of the things that various scholars have looked at, including Neville Ritchie in his work in the Chinese during the 1980s, was how the Chinese adopted European clothing. And in some of the American literature, this has been sort of tied with ideas of acculturation into the West, into sort of American Western, American European culture and so on. And certainly all these gentlemen here on the right appear to be wearing very Western clothes. And G6, a burial there, he had his shirt was still in the grave. And you can see there it is on the left-hand side with a sort of very crude, you know, drawing it up in sort of isometric drawing. A very, very square cut, very, you know, rectangular cloth with a hole in it, folded over and sewn up the sleeves with an arm on either side. Very simple, but this is very typical of late 18th century and 19th century working class clothing. And there's lots of sewing manuals and manuals for seamstresses and so on, which don't show you and how to make these clothes. They're easy to make, and they involve the minimum of wastage in material, because everything's in nice square rectangulars, but quite a baggy shirt, which is sort of what we saw in those photographs of Gabriel's Gully. So these Chinese men here, you can't really see their shirts because they're well wrapped up in these heavy woolen jackets. But we know that from the archaeological evidence, they had these Western style shirts. How much that is sort of acculturation and how much it is pragmatism is sort of hard to tell, because you have to remember that Central Otago is very seasonal. The summers are very, very hot and the winters are freezing. And Guangdong, you know, where these people are coming from, is semi-tropical. So any of their clothes from home would be useless here in the middle of an Otago winter. You have to have wool, and you had to have pragmatic, everyday working woolen garments, which European garments are available. So they probably had no choice. You had to adopt the local style of dressing just to survive an Otago winter. There is an intriguing difference in some of the buttons we're finding, particularly the white milk glass, these very white, small buttons, which are often used in shirts and underclothing. They appear to be very much more common at Ardrossan Street, with a largely European sort of population, and much, much less common at Gabriel Street with the Chinese. So it's possible, it looks like that the Chinese were adopting Western outer garments, but not necessarily underclothing. But of course, underclothing is something in the Goldfields is something we have very little information about. But this, again, tantalizing information there. So speaking about the Chinese and moving along, Drybread, another Goldfields, this cemetery. This is the last cemetery which we investigated. It's further inland into Central Otago. And we excavated here in 2020 in the cemetery, and 2020, 2021, 2022 in the sort of the wider landscape, looking at some of the settlement evidence. Its history of the cemetery is sort of not very good. A lot of the records were lost in a 1936 fire. This happens to a lot of early, cemeteries. It's still in use, and it's run by the Drybread Cemetery trustees. And they actually approached us. They came to us and asked us, "Can you help? We have a cemetery. We know that it was opened during the gold rush. We have no records." And there were people who want to book grave plots, and the trustees simply didn't know if they were occupied or not. Again, remote sensing have been tried here. It didn't give any useful results. So we went and, wrong button, excavated. And we stripped off quite a big area of ground, again with the digger, looked for the grave cuts, dug down, and we found, we think, all the unmarked burials with no records. So this is a picture of the November 2020 excavations. There's Hallie Buckley sort of standing there in the bottom right-hand photograph, standing, looking, keeping an eye on people working. The two diggers, they're cleaning the top of the coffin of burial D3, which I'll get to in a minute. Really, really interesting burial D3. He's a Chinese gentleman, and we know who he is. Drybread is interesting because it's the farm all around the cemetery is owned by Tony and Karen Glassford, who are also the cemetery trustees. And here's Tony Glassford standing here. Now, his family have been here since 1864. They actually came there just after the gold rush. And so they've been on this land continuously since then. So their knowledge of the place is really detailed and excellent. And his grandfather had actually told him that there were 6 Chinese burials in the bottom right-hand corner of the cemetery. And sure enough, we found 6 Chinese burials, unmarked Chinese burials, exactly there. So on the right-hand side is the plan we made. And you can see it's very full of existing grave plots and grave enclosures and headstones. So we had to work very, very carefully around them to make sure we didn't disturb anything that was there. And we're looking at these gaps. And we found 12 unmarked burials for which there were no records. And 6 of them were Chinese, as I said, in that bottom right-hand corner. One of them had been historically exhumed. So one had gone back on the Hoi Hao or the Ventnor. The other 5 were still there. And we also searched for Drybread itself. Drybread was a gold rush settlement which has disappeared. And I'll come to that in a minute. I'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. So, so yeah, we excavated these 12 burials. And as I said, burial D3, one of these, the Chinese, we identified who it was. Two of the Chinese, we actually found out who they were because we could still read the coffin plate on the top of their coffin. And that's D3's coffin plate on the bottom right there. I know you say, well, we can't read that. It's very hard to see. If you get the light right and the moisture right and you hold your head the right way, you can read it. And it says R1, aged 62 years. And we know from Papers Past, which is New Zealand equivalent of Trove for the newspapers database. We found out quite a bit about R1, and he died in October 1895. And his burial, his coffin, this is the best preserved coffin in all of our excavations we've done to date, that Hallie and I have directed. This is the best preserved coffin. The lid was actually still intact. We actually had to literally take the lid off coffin. And R1 was lying there, as you can see in the picture on the right, still fully dressed in a jacket, waistcoat, trousers, lying there. And the coffin was actually full of water as well. We had to ladle the water out. The coffin lid, the decoration you can see there with the coffin plate and the coffin lace and the angel over the head and the flower vase over the head, over the feet. This is something we talk a lot about in the research we're doing as well. It's, you know, typical Victorian coffin furniture. And you can trace this back very much to the British traditions, but it's in much of the Anglo world, it's very much the same. And it's quite consistent for many, many years. An 1870s and an 1880s, 1890s burials all look very similar to the 1890s here. Now, R1 had a queue, which is the traditional Chinese plaited pigtail. And what came as a great surprise to all of us, he had a false queue. This is a cord woven into his natural hair, which was quite short, about 4 inches, 5 inches, and then he had this long queue plaited in. So you can imagine there were the usual jokes about first hair extensions and so on. It was we were all quite intrigued by this because no one had seen it before. But as it happens, once we started delving into the literature, it's been noted a number of times in the United States amongst overseas Chinese burials as well. So it's another avenue of evidence which is very, very strongly linking the New Zealand Goldfields Chinese, not just to China, but also to all these other overseas Chinese populations during the gold rush, and also civil engineering projects, you know, like the American railway construction, and somewhere the Chinese were working. So we get these international links amongst overseas Chinese, which are really fascinating. You know, when you're looking at funerary traditions, the way they were dressing, their hairstyles, and their links back to home, and also the repatriation programs, which are also active over in Australia and America and so on as well. So we're getting all these links coming up with our work, with other people's work overseas. Now, I talked about the clothing, Gabriel at Ardrossan Street and Gabriel Street, and here at Drybread, this is the jacket and the waistcoat that R1 was wearing. These are, again, as you can see, quite similar to the other garments. They're wool, fairly heavy wool. You've got a lapelled waistcoat, a jacket with a fairly high lapel, quite an old-fashioned cut, what you'd expect, tape and so on. It looks, these are actually quite good quality. They're nicely made clothes, and they look quite smart. They would have looked very smart when he was buried. He was obviously well-dressed when he was buried. But these hide a real secret, which is absolutely fascinating from our research point of view. This is the front of the garments. They look utterly conventional, good quality, but not unsurprising at all. These are the back of the garments. This is the back panel of the jacket and the two sleeves. And as you can see, these haven't distorted from being in the ground, being buried in the ground for 130 years. These were cut very, very asymmetrically. As you can see, the back panel of his jacket there, you can see this is the back panel. So you're actually looking at it with true left and true right, you know, as you're looking at it. The left-hand armhole is high, and the right-hand armhole, you can see the curve out to the armpit, is lower and further out. And the two sleeves, and here this is looking at the front of the jacket, so it's the true left is on our right. You can see that the true left sleeve is much straighter than the true right sleeve, which is shorter and much more bent. What Hallie found when she examined the skeleton of R1 was that he had quite a badly degenerated spine. He has some serious spinal issues going on, quite asymmetrical ligament changes, and it looks like he had scoliosis. So a curved spine, and probably one shoulder dropped, and possibly one arm, unusable. And certainly she found that one arm, the muscle attachments on one arm were very strong, like he's using that arm all the time, and the other arm very weak, like he wasn't using it. And you couldn't see that in the front of the jacket, but here's the back of the jacket. What this suggests to me is that this jacket was tailor-made for him. He had it made. It's not secondhand, and we have good evidence of other Chinese wearing secondhand clothes. It's not off the peg. This has been carefully tailored to suit his very, very severe curvature of the spine, but in a way that the appearance is minimized from the front, these being the front panels of both the waistcoat and the jacket, and that curvature is all taken up in the back. So he's there's been a lot of effort going into tailoring these clothes to fit this gentleman. Now, I could go on for a very long time about the meaning of this and his role in the Goldfields, but what the rabbit hole I'm going down with this, and we'll be going down with with the writing we're doing at the moment, is about agency. It's about the Chinese miners not just being actors in the Goldfields, not coming, digging, going home with their money, not just being victimized, as we know there was a lot of prejudice against the Chinese in all the overseas goldfields. But it's very much about these people as individuals and their agency in the communities they were working in, and the ways they found of adapting to the hardships of life. And this gentleman definitely had hardships. He was quite badly handicapped in one side. But he adapted. He forged on. So again, this is a really interesting avenue that we're pursuing at the moment. Now, as I said, I'd talk about the landscape. We were really hoping that we would find some of these huts where we know the Chinese and the miners were living in the diggings, and we were foiled. And this is because of the landscape. Landscapes change, and this landscape has changed. It's like a palimpsest. Drybread is a really interesting place, and it's unpicking that landscape and interpreting how it's changed over time and the landscape history, and then trying to put the people back into that landscape at different times in that landscape is part of what we've been doing. The photographs here, the top left-hand photograph, the Land Rover, and that's Jesse Garland standing there. That's actually about where the township was, and I'll get to that in a moment. At the foot of the Dunstan Mountains there, and on the right, that's the Drybread diggings. This is this isn't the gold rush diggings. This isn't people there with a shovel and a pan. This is the diggings that came later. This is the hydraulic sluicing. This is the big diggings where you're using water cannons to wash things down. And I'll get again a photograph of that in a moment. So we know where Drybread was. It was one of a series of small goldfields along the foot of the Dunstan Mountains. And so top right hand on this 1863 map, you can see there's Drybread, Tinkers, and Devonshire were the three diggings there. Tinkers later became known as Matakinuri. And Matakinuri station, you can see that's a preemptive right for the pastoral lease there. And you can see J.G. Glassford, that's the Glassfords, which is Tony and Karen Glassford's family. Next, and this is a 1884 plan. And again, by this time the township had gone, the little town gold rush diggings of Drybread had gone, but the diggings are still there, and it's marked Drybread diggings. And if you can see right smack bang in the middle of this plan, there's section 2, little square, that's a cemetery, which is still there and still occupied. And you can see the Tinkers diggings, bigger diggings off to the left there, and Thompson's Creek going up to the top left there. Now, there's one picture of Drybread, and this is a sketch. And I was talking about photography in the Goldfields when we've never yet found a photograph of Drybread. There are photographs of the area a few years later, but no one's ever found a photograph of that gold rush town. And this is a sketch by a gentleman called Andrew Hamilton, who left behind a legacy of beautiful pencil sketches, which are now held by the Lakes District Museum in Arrowtown. But we know almost nothing about the gentleman himself. And he's a mystery. He just disappears. But we have these sketches, and this is all we had. And this is, and no one knew exactly where Drybread was. So we started wondering about that landscape, and it turns out that Andrew Hamilton was a very good artist, because you could actually work out exactly where he was standing when he made that sketch. It doesn't look quite as convincing in a photograph as it does in real life, but what I've done is I've arrowed the points which are absolutely common, and you can see here I am standing basically where he was standing. The township was in front of me, but the thing about it is you can see this is now a flat paddock, but you can see just off to the left and up, that's the Drybread diggings. Well, that flat paddock is the sludge channel, the tail race out of those diggings. So Drybread in 1864-65 was established on the banks of the creek that ran in this valley. But very quickly, as the diggings upstream took off, particularly as hydraulic sluicing came in and bigger quantities of dirt came down that creek, yeah, the site was just inundated under tailings. So we know where it was. And we even had a optimistic bash of seeing if we could find it. We drilled a few auger holes. We could go down, I think, about 12 feet and nothing but tailings. Realistically, it's going to be 30, 40, 50 feet down there, maybe more. So I think that site's buried forever. We were guided. We had some really useful help from the surveying school at the university. Richard Hemme came and helped us, and actually this 1872 plan, which shows a few of the last houses at the old town before they disappeared, he actually pegged out exactly where they would have been. So we weren't digging blind. We targeted our digging very carefully, but still too deep. So understanding the landscape is really important here. Not just for the township itself, which we now know is buried in the sludge channel, but also for all the little hut sites which were once scattered about in the diggings. There's not all diggers, not all miners lived in townships. Many lived amongst the diggings in little huts, and we just couldn't find any of them. We looked, and we know where they were, but we couldn't find any. So we had to go back to trying to understand why we couldn't find any. We were very, very, very fortunate in that we've got very, very good 1938 aerial photographs, very detailed, and stereo pairs. So I can look at these and understand really, really well how the landscape has changed since 1938, when you could see hut sites, and today when you can't so much. So what are the agents of this landscape change at Drybread? Well, the first people in this landscape were obviously the Maori explorers and travellers. Thompson's Gorge, which you can see behind, this is in the shadow behind the cemetery there, and going through the Dunstans, that is a traditional route. It's still a modern route. There's a dirt road run through it. So people have been traversing this landscape for 800 years, let's say. And those first Maori explorers, they were burning off vegetation, they were altering the landscape. Then the Europeans arrived, and they carried on altering the landscape. The first people here were the pastoralists. This was run 223 Matakanui. So it was stocked by 1859, so before the gold rush was kicked off. So there were sheep here as early as that. Then, of course, yeah, we get the gold rush. There's the classic illustrated London News picture of gold diggers out prospecting, which people in England were seeing in the 60s. There, bottom left again, you've got those Drybread diggings that I was talking about, and bottom right, I think this is actually Matakanui, but it's just a mile or so along the Dunstans. But you can see how the miners, once they got the water races and the water cannons up and going, how quickly they could modify that landscape. But there were still echoes of that, not just the landscape itself, but this is Tony and Karen Glassford's farm workshop. And if you look at the workbench, holding the 3 posts holding up that workbench, the middle one is a sluice nozzle. So it's the water cannon from the diggings a few hundred yards away. So there are these echoes of past activities just carry on in that landscape. There's details everywhere if you start to go and look. But then, of course, it's the farming landscape. It's particularly post-war farming landscape that really changed things. In the 1970s, farm development loans came in, so farmers could get money to develop their land, which at the time, of course, was seen as wasteland, a lot of it. And on the Glassford farm, there's Tony Glassford, top right-hand corner, with his brother and his father, in one of the ruins from it's an old hotel ruin from Drybread, taken in 1967. Tony's father bulldozed this with that bulldozer. It's a Caterpillar D2, serial number 5U6163. It's not often that you can be that specific about how a landscape has changed by giving the serial number of the bulldozer, but we can here. And so you can see on the left here, those 2 aerial photographs. This is why we couldn't find those hut sites, because they'd all been smoothed off. They'd been dozed off. Not with big machinery, but with a little D2, but just over weeks and weeks, years of just developing that farm, all these little hut sites got smoothed off. So the big scale landscape stays, the diggings, the big gullies and so on, but the fine detail, a lot of it has gone. But we went looking nonetheless. And so in November 2020, we had a good look around the property. Everywhere where Karen and Tony had seen glass, bottles, nails, and we were very fortunate because, of course, they've been on the property forever. Certainly there are these bits of min material sort of in various places, but a lot of it's disturbed. We can definitely find evidence of this 19th century occupation, but we were scratching to find in situ archaeological evidence. We dug a few holes and so on. Fortunately, we did find one place, and it was enclosed by a load of poplar trees, both black poplar and Lombardy poplars, which have been planted. And we dug some test pits and found some materials. We dug some more test pits and found more material. And you can see here the test pits on the left, and then on the right, some sort of bone midden. That's all sheep bone with quite a bit of rabbit in there as well. But we're also finding artifactual material, bottle glass, ceramics and nails. And the nails are really interesting because the nails are all cut nails. So they're all sort of pre-1870, 1880. So they're the right period for the Goldfields. So we went back and we did some more excavation, and intriguingly, we couldn't find the house as such. So I think it's probably a wooden house that had been basically gone. What we did find was a very elaborate front garden. This is, you can see here, sort of standing basically where the house was. The picture on the right, I'm actually standing on top of the car, looking along the garden. And you've got the front path, and then it splits with a perfect oval curve and then meets again at the bottom. And then the poplar directly in front of you in this view on the right, that was on one gate post, and there would have been a mate on the other side. So whoever built this, right on the edge of the diggings, like there's a sluice channel right beside this, spent a lot of time to not only lay out a beautiful front garden with a curved path, and the path is all gravelled, with the poplars and so on around it. It was what you might call proper gardening, and it was not just a veggie garden. It was an ornamental garden. And when you look through the newspaper records, there are quite a few records of gardens, but people just talk about gardens, and you assume they're going to be largely sort of fruit trees or productive gardens, fruit trees, veggie gardens, and so on. And there is a bit of research about early gardens in Otago. Paula Smith wrote a thesis some years ago, which is very good. And so this is another avenue we're writing about at the moment, is people making a home in the Goldfields. not just a little hut on the edge of the digging, but actually a home with gardens and gravel pathways, and investing energy and time and thought into creating a new home, a new environment for themselves. One thing we didn't find was any Chinese huts, which was actually a great disappointment for both Hallie and I. We're both really hoping we would, and obviously they're known from elsewhere in Otago, but Drybread, we drew a blank. So here's that Drybread again. This is that whole landscape, the Google Earth aerial. So there, right in the middle, you can see the site of Drybread, and you can see how it's clearly in this sludge channel from the diggings. The Poplar's excavation is marked sort of above centre there. That's where we found that house with the garden, right beside, I said, the diggings, and the cemetery there nearby as well. So we now understand this landscape much better, and we understand a little bit about the people who are living there. And as with research all the time, the answers we're getting aren't necessarily always the answers to the questions we posed. We went out looking for Chinese huts. We came back finding, you know, gardening history, but you know, it's telling us about the people and their lives and how they made new lives in this place, which is what our project right from the start in 2016 has been. Many outcomes from the project, many publications. The Milton, I haven't talked about Milton, there's one monograph out. Much better understanding of the health of the individuals. Again, that's what Hallie's looking at more than I am, so I'll leave that to her. First New Zealand evidence of the exhumations and repatriations from an archaeological perspective, which is and much better understanding of the Chinese adaptations. So building on the work that Neville Ritchie did in the 1980s and others, we're you know, and we've been working with Neville. Much better understanding of the Chinese now, and particularly Chinese agency in the Goldfields, and some really good, strong comparative data regarding the Chinese experiences here and the US and Australia. Looking at the Drybread landscape, and very, very actively working with the local communities, the Drybread trustees, and also in Lawrence, helping to restore that cemetery. So we're still working there with the local council and Chinese there. All of the individuals we investigated in these cemeteries have all been reburied in 2022 and 2023 with all the appropriate ceremonies, Christian and Chinese and so on. So I see from my clock on the right here that I'm running a bit over, so I apologize for that. So just acknowledgements to everyone who's been involved in the project. It is a cast of thousands, particularly the Marsden Fund for the funding. Yeah, particularly grateful to Les and Maisie Wong, who've been pillars of strength throughout all the Goldfields work, but everyone else as well, Karen and Tony, and all the excavators. So thank you very much. Yes.
Great, thank you very much, Peter. If people have questions, would you like to pop them in the chat or do a reaction on the screen and put your hand up? I have one, Peter, which probably relates to my ignorance of these matters rather than my understanding of them, but I know that in Lindsay Smith's work in Australia for his PhD, when he was looking at Chinese settlements, some of his work looked a lot at kind of hierarchical organisation and Chinese people travelling, being guided by a headman, and you know, that the kind of layout of the settlements was very different from say the average settlement, Goldfields settlement dominated by British or other ethnicities of miners. Is that kind of a pattern that's emerged elsewhere in New Zealand? But you know, you were saying you couldn't find the Chinese huts, but there was this process of, you know, mining for gold would bring prosperity, and then you could move from the calico tent to a better situation in a hut, etc., etc. Is that the overall pattern as well for these goldfields?
You were breaking up a little bit there, but I got 90% of that question. Yes, there's lots of historical information about the role of the merchants and the headmen in these Chinese communities. And of course, what I haven't talked about is the Lawrence Chinese camp, which is the Chinese settlement in Lawrence, which was the largest Chinese settlement in Otago, which the University of Otago, the anthropology department, have been investigating as a sort of, that's a separate piece of research. And we sort of have been waiting to see their results. And there you definitely did have people at Sam Tulane, who was one of the sort of the merchants, the entrepreneurs there at Lawrence, and So Hoi, and you know, the wealthy merchants in Dunedin. So yes, there's a lot of hierarchy going on, both hierarchy, but also different networks. Like you had different clan networks and county networks, which are sort of parallel rather than hierarchical going on as well in the Goldfields. So yeah, it's a much more complex story than I've told here, and it's certainly going on. With the cemetery work, though, you have to remember that we're trying to place it in a broad narrative, but we are in many ways looking at quite a narrow sort of sample of people and material culture. So it's trying to place what we're finding in specifics within a broader picture is what we're doing to a degree. But we're also very interested in individual agency. So it's looking at the experiences of these individual people, rather than trying to build up a big narrative of Chinese society in the Goldfields. It's actually, did this person, how did this person survive in this place? What was their health like? So we're sort of, we are quite, like with R1 at Drybread, you know, really going into his experience. So yeah, it's, the questions we're asking are often more that sort of level, I have to say.
Great, thank you. We have a question in the chat, which is actually related to what kind, you mentioned actually in your talk very briefly that, you know, you're working on writing up and you know, other results that would come out of the project. But there's just a question here about, have there been already any written products from this work that, you know, people can find and look at, or are they about to be forthcoming, and particularly regarding the material culture of the graves, so grave goods, coffin decoration, you know, the things you were mentioning in your talk?
Yeah, no, there's lots. We've got, we've already, I don't know, can you see that? That's, this is the monograph on the Milton excavation, and that's been published through BAR, British Archaeological Reports, and that's available. You can go online and find that and order that. And we're working on the two subsequent monographs in the same series for Lawrence and Drybread at the moment. But there are also large numbers of papers on many different aspects. There's a Southern Cemeteries blog you can go to. Just Google Southern Settlers Archaeology, or any combination of those words, you'll find it. Lots of papers by all members of the project. Google is your friend there. Just Google. If you Google Hallie Buckley and myself through Google Scholar, you'll find them.
Great, thank you. I have a follow-up question, if I may, which was particularly given that some of these places, or the authorities for these places, are private individuals really, or families. What actually happens, or is likely to happen, to the collection and the remains once the analysis and understanding of it is complete?
All the human remains are reburied, and a condition of our, we're working under an archaeological authority and a disinterment license, and the condition of the disinterment license is all grave goods are returned to the grave. So everything has gone back to the grave. All those clothes, all the coin, everything has been reburied.
Right, thank you. I don't see any other questions popping up there in the chat. I'll do a last call on that for everybody. There's lots of comments, Peter, about how absolutely fascinating and interesting the presentation is. So everyone's really enjoyed it. But if there's anyone with a burning question, either raise your hand or pop it in the chat.
Everyone's running away to watch the football.
Yes, indeed.
That's my fault. I went over.
No, there's still time. People could still throw in a question and still make that kick off. But it looks like I think that just means your presentation was absolutely comprehensive and fascinating. So that most of the questions were anticipated by the material that you presented. But Asher would certainly like to thank you very much. We would also like to thank all the people who booked and attended this seminar, and we would ask everyone to keep an eye on the Asher website and the Asher calendar of events. The next big item for us is the Asher conference, which will be in September in Queensland. So we ask all the Asher members to think about going. There's been a few calls for papers, and it would be great to see people there if people are able to make it and do the travel and register. But thank you very much indeed, Peter. A fascinating topic. Another great presentation comment popping up in the chat. So people have really enjoyed it, and it was terrific. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you. It's good to tell the stories.
We have a question here from Hilda McLean. You'll have to unmute yourself, Hilda.
Oh, I just would like to congratulate Peter and his team for the work, because for those people who recognise my name, this is a field I've been working in some time, particularly on Chinese exhumations and burials. So I was just wanting to say that I will probably hoping that you might be presenting at Asher. And are you coming across to Asher in Mackay, or were you?
No, unfortunately, I can't make it.
Okay, well, I'll catch up with you offline then.
Yeah,
Thanks,
yeah,
Siobhan.
no, yeah, definitely.
Okay, thanks, Siobhan.
Okay, great. It's good to see you, Hilda, even though I can't see you. You're just a black screen. All right, everyone, I think we'll call time on the seminar and close it now. But thanks again, everyone, and thanks particularly to Peter for giving us an insight into that fascinating work.
Well, thank you.